Welcome, everybody, here and in virtual reality with Zoom, to what I hope will be food for thought at your lunch hour. And we're starting a three-part series to introduce our overarching theme, everybody brings something to the table. And what we mean is that there isn't one individual on this planet who does not eat, and no culture that does not cook. Animals have a raw diet. So the fact that we eat our food is what makes us different animals, human beings. Cooking is the one indisputable activity we all share in common, a shared experience that makes us alike no matter who or where we are. And in divisive times like these, focusing on what makes us feel alike feels huge. So we're going to do that. And I want to introduce who the us is here. Star Pelsu is our tech genius who handles the beautiful visual education. And Gail McKibben is our prop queen who is sharing material with you at the end. And for those of you on Zoom, we have left some Portland food maps, which we are handing out at the front desk for you to take. And I'm Sandy Garson, a former caterer, cookie creator, and founder of the local Maine food movement back in 1980. And I'm now a food historian who wrote this talk, so you can yell at me. We call the first series in our explanation of human commonality the Geography of Groceries. In other words, where on earth did your food come from? And we're going to explore how all those ingredients on your dinner table got there. If I can quote the Beatles, it's a long and winding road that leads to your door. And along that road, we're going to discover how you stayed home in Maine while your stomach broke out and went global on you. And so on that road, we have to look at the human psyche. And it is this: deepest fear is you will not eat, you will not survive. So we all have that fear of finding food, and access to food is critical. And that is why the oldest military trick in the book that goes back as long as humankind is the siege. And what is the siege essentially? It is blocking your enemy from getting food and water so they starve to death or capitulate. Either way, you win, unless somebody outsmarts you. And for about 4,000 years, nobody figured out how to outsmart a siege. And sieges are, by the way, still happening today. If you read the paper, you can see that the Russians are being accused of starving people in Mariupol, and there are accusations of starvation deliberate in the Gaza Strip. So just to show you how vital it is to that in history that human beings eat and how sieges do affect our history, I want to talk briefly about one of my favorite events in world history, which I call Pie in the Sky. That is what I call the astonishing but now forgotten Operation Vittles, the only military campaign in recorded history that was entirely about delivering food to save the world. The dream of food falling freely from the sky goes back to the Bible with its lyrical longings of manna from heaven. And it actually came true in the middle of the 20th century. For 15 months, over 500,000 tons of food rained down steadily and fell faster and faster from the hulls of cargo planes that were taxiing across tarmac in what was the spectacularly daring Operation Vittles, code name for a military campaign that never fired one bomb or bullet. Milk, a proud Douglas aircraft advertisement exclaimed, "New weapon of democracy." Actually, flour, salt, yeast, dehydrated potatoes, and sugar fell with that milk into the arms of more than 2 million war-weary people stranded on the ground in West Berlin, Germany, our former enemy. Only 3 years before, in 1945, these same people we were now blessing with survival from the sky had been enemy combatants, but now we needed them as vital allies. When World War II ended with the 4 Allied victors carving up the defeated Germany into 4 quarters, the Americans, British, and French, as you remember, merged their zones into a seamless democratic West Germany. But their award also included part of the Reich's powerful capital city, Berlin, which was a non-contiguous piece of property deep inside the section handed to the Soviets. And their ruler, the shrewd and stealthy Stalin, was quick to detect the opportunity in this geographical quirk. So, as if nothing had changed between prehistory and post-nuclear bombs, Stalin abruptly blocked the supply roads into West Berlin, fiendishly figuring he had finessed the more than 2 million Germans stuck inside its confines. They would have to surrender to Soviet communism or starve to death. And Lenin had said, whoever has Germany has all of Europe. And Stalin saw the collapse of West Berlin as the start of a delicious domino game in which all of West Germany and then all of Western Europe, country by war-weakened country, would yield to him if West Berlin couldn't eat dinner. Communism would conquer the world. Fortunately, he forgot that the world he wanted to control had changed. People still needed food, but standing his Soviet ground to blockade their supply roads was no longer a foolproof plan when there was a new avenue into West Berlin, a 20-mile wide corridor up in the air. Alarmed by the Soviet sudden startling siege and the ruthless calculation that energized it, the Allies nervously concluded the fall of Germany could only be prevented by a preposterous fall of food from that heavenly inroad. And so on June 26, 1948, the Army Corps, Air Corps, and the Royal Air Force that 3 years earlier had been dropping firebombs on West Berlin started bombing it with tins of coffee and corned beef and tuna fish. The logistical triumph of this Berlin airlift, as history calls it, had no precedent and it has never been replicated. Just this once in all of recorded time, 32,900 military personnel, along with another 23,000 civilians, devoted themselves to what was a mess call. The careful calibration and combination of food, the agonized calculation of cargo carriage, including flour dust and salt corrosion, the grinding tedium of motor mechanics, and the excruciating alertness of what became very tight precision flying, all combined into a campaign to forge an invincible food chain. Every 3 minutes around the clock for a year, a cargo plane swooped through the narrow, often snow-filled, foggy airspace and dropped tons of edibles into West Berlin. 92 million miles flown, 277,000 flights, all records broken later in what was the Easter parade of April 1949, when 13,000 tons of food and coal were dropped by planes that landed every 30 seconds for 24 hours in a spirited show of can-do determination to keep food on West Berlin tables. This was the stop sign, the Easter parade, that convinced Stalin to end the siege. The first airlift came down clumsily and uncertainly through bomb-shattered buildings. The commandant of America's Berlin section later said, "But they were the most beautiful things I have ever seen." As the planes touched down and bags of flour began to spill out of their bellies, I realized this is the beginning of something wonderful. And I went back to my office, breathless with elation, like a man who has made a great discovery and cannot hide his joy. The West Germans could not hide their joy either. What truly heartened them and renewed their resolve were the square brown cartons occasionally dropped along with the dried eggs and dehydrated vegetables. These didn't look like much, all being the same on the outside, but inside every one of those 200,000 cartons flown over what the West Berliners called the Luftbrücke or air bridge was packed with 30 pounds of gourmet goodies. Varying combinations now of bacon, jam, raisins, chocolate, macaroni, real coffee, peanut butter, canned tuna, cocoa, and more. Every box was formulated to have enough for 10 people for 1 day or 1 person for 10 days. And it was, quote, a gift from an unknown stranger in America, someone who had compassionately shelled out $10 to $15 for what was called a care package created by a charitable coalition that called itself the Cooperative for American Remittance to Europe. So this is the origin of our care package. All the care at a cost of $400,000 a day was more than amply rewarded. Things really changed after that airlift started, one American pilot reported. People said before the airlift, if an American soldier walked into a cafe, the Germans would get up and leave. A week after the airlift started, it was altogether different. They were hugging each other. Hearts and minds had been won through stomachs. The American flyers now stopped doubting even for a second that the German mechanics recruited to tinker with their planes on the tarmac at Temple and Tegel airports would sabotage them. In fact, once the airlift got underway and West Berlin realized more runways could get them more food, there was something they could do to help. 17,000 Berliners rushed out the Tegel airport in 92 days with a new runway, which was then inaugurated with a drop of 20,000 pounds of cheese. The circumstances were unceasingly dangerous and debilitating, but the pilots came through, keenly aware how much depended on dinner. On a dark, bitterly snowy night, this is my favorite story, a young pilot named Sam Myers found himself losing attitude because ice was building up on the wings of his plane and choking the carburetor, and he was in a perilous position in this sort of choreography of planes. And it was so tightly controlled, there were planes below and behind, and he had to keep his place in this parade. And he was quick-witted enough that he sent the co-pilot crawling back through the cargo, and he jettisoned the heaviest sacks on the plane so that it would rise to its prescribed position. Myers later said, "I often wondered what people on the ground in Soviet-controlled East Germany were thinking as 4,000 pounds of macaroni came raining down out of the sky with all that snow." A young pilot from Utah, Gail Halverson, knew what the children of West Berlin were thinking when he wiggled his plane wings. They would come running eagerly to the perimeter of the airport and catch the handkerchief parachutes he was dropping, full of candy he was scrounging from rations. When a German reporter blew his cover, Halverson's superiors ordered him to get over this gimmick. But the day later, they immediately recanted, realizing the mistake. And as he said, Halverson, the floodgates opened. The American Confectioners Association now shipped tons of treats to the candy bomber to drop all over West Berlin in special parachutes that were now made by children at schools in the Massachusetts textile town of Lowell. The military actually codenamed this candy campaign Operation Little Fiddles. Offering food, you see, made trusted friends of bitter enemies and instantly erased the vicious divisiveness of the war. And its cockeyed optimism foiled the sociopathic Stalin, who never even got a toehold in West Berlin. With shock and awe, food had dramatically changed German psychology from conquered to conquering. The successful cooperation that characterized this airlift is what gave birth to NATO, to the resounding prosperity of West Germany, to what became the European Union, and arguably the fall of the wall and the disintegration of the Iron Curtain. So food matters. But notice I said how the food in this drop had to be calibrated carefully. This is because what is equally crucial to getting food is to get food that you know isn't going to kill you. And that is why human beings have a deep primal instinct to avoid foods we don't recognize because they could be poisonous. How do you respond to an unfamiliar dish, something you've never seen before? You're a little loath to try it. Something says you get nervous. Could make you sick. And we know, by the way, that many American POWs in World War II who were held by the Germans in North Africa died of starvation because they weren't going to eat the fried locusts and other normal food of that region, even though a locust is a shrimp in the air. Right. So the same was true in the Pacific, where captured troops would not swallow the weird Japanese food and died of starvation. So what does this mean for our talk about the geography of groceries? Well, it is this fear of the unfamiliar, or of not having food is why almost every immigrant will bring to his or her new country their own trustworthy food, something recognizable. And this takeout, as I call it, is why today in America, you and I are eating spaghetti, okra, Jewish deli, and chow mein. None of this is native. The Wabanaki didn't eat it, and the original Scotch-Irish didn't make it. So here's a personal example of how this works. About 12 years ago, I brought a Nepali mother of my adopted godson from Kathmandu to San Francisco, where he was living and just got citizenship. Because since childhood, he had been the sole support of his widowed mother, and because she lived alone, he wanted her to come and live with him. But she had never been beyond Kathmandu in her life. She had never been near an airplane. She hadn't even gone to the airport. She was a very simple woman committed to family and feeding her friends. I said, you can take 2 large suitcases with you and a handbag. That was the plain limit. And when I arrived to fetch her for the airport, she had 3 large suitcases and absolutely refused to sacrifice any of them. Not appreciating that we had to keep moving to catch a plane, she stopped and opened 2 of those suitcases and very animatedly started showing me she can't leave without all this food, because how else was she going to cook for her son all the food he expected her to make, and the only food she knew how to make. And every attempt I made to reassure her there were going to be Indian markets in the Bay Area, she could get all those spices, lentils, and fermented grains in her suitcase, failed to budge her. Indian mustard oil is not Nepali, she said. And so off we went to the airport with 3 suitcases. And because I only had one, I had to take one at first. And then I had to face the enormous hurdle of US Customs, which forbids bringing in all the food she had stashed in mine and her suitcases. And I had the guile to succeed by distracting the customs people. And with great glee, she arrived ready to cook authentic food for her son, what she knew how to cook. And so let's look at that another way. You and I go to a strange place, and we are likely to seek out familiar food. This is the dark secret of the success of franchising, like McDonald's that line the American highway. You see it, you know what you're going to get, no matter where you are, and you feel safe eating there, even if you don't like it. You know you're going to come out alive. I didn't do that one time. I thought I'm going to be smart, and I went past the Golden Arches in the middle of Kansas on the highway to a local diner. And I thought, I'm going to have, it was Easter Sunday, and I'm going to have scrambled eggs and toast. And I spent 3 days sick from having eaten whatever it was, the butter, the eggs, and a meal I thought was going to be very safe. And I've never made that mistake again. I don't like franchises, but on the highway, they're my favorite food. And this is because all of us have this primal fear of eating something poisonous. You need to recognize your food. And that is why we eat to keep eating their food, that they recognize immigrants who often don't find jobs for their skills or language will end up cooking and serving dinners to themselves, their family, their neighbors, other members of their immigrant community. Sometimes it starts as just an offering to their co-immigrants, and then artists, world travelers, and adventurers pop in, and then you get a food truck, and then you get a neighborhood place, and then it becomes a brick and mortar place. And that is how we get foreign restaurants in our towns and cities. If you want to see where the various nationalities are living, where the immigrants have come from, for example, just look at the restaurants around you. You can do this very easily now in a flash in Maine. We've given you the Portland food map, and it will break down all the restaurants by ethnicity. And you will see Portland has restaurants owned by Ethiopians, Nigerians, Bosnians, Jamaicans, you name it. This is just an example of how global Portland has become. And it's a good look at who is here. Also, there was a headline in the Press Herald about 3 years ago saying this: Westbrook schools incorporate student cultures into the lunch menu. The district is introducing dishes from Africa and the Middle East into school lunch to offer the immigrant students something familiar and to broaden the palates of American-born kids. So this is how you stay in Maine and your stomach is traveling all over the world. Chinese people are especially involved in bringing food with them because they will never eat anything but Chinese food. Trust me, I've been around them. Chinese food is what makes them Chinese in their mind. And this explains why you will find some Chinese food joint in just about every hamlet on earth, and why our cities eventually get Chinatowns. Even if they are not as chauvinistic as the Chinese, other people cling to their habituated taste buds, and along with little eateries, they will open groceries to supply their kitchen, which is why towns will have a Little Italy or a neighborhood of bodegas like San Francisco's Mission. Just look along Forest Avenue in Portland now. Across the street from a Colombian restaurant is a Middle Eastern grocery, and that is 3 blocks from another Middle Eastern grocery, often patronized by Somalis. And across the street from that is a Vietnamese spa joint and an Iraqi takeout. And there was just an article yesterday in the New York Times talking about the spread of these original ethnic grocery stores, Ranch 99 on the West Coast, and the Korean Market H, and the Patel Brothers Indian markets. And they have now become supermarket chains like Shaw's in Hannaford. And the headline said, "Don't call this ethnic food, it is American food. People are buying more salsa than ketchup, people are buying more kimchi than sauerkraut. These are no longer ethnic food restaurants." So this is how it all changes. Our groceries have to come from somewhere, and we have 2 options: produce it or import it. In California, most of the small truck farms are operated by the Asians who want to eat their food. And this is how they get all the ingredients they need, and then they sell their produce, various grains you and I won't recognize, at farmers markets. We here in Maine have Somali farms, and you will find those farmers at our farmers markets, often with produce like okra and very hot chili peppers, which are not necessarily commonly eaten here. We have Somali herders their familiar meat is goat. 10 years ago, you couldn't find a goat in Maine unless you went to a wool producer and pleaded for the slaughter. Few of us did that because goat is not familiar to Mainers and therefore something scary to be avoided. And that's why when the Indians would serve it in India to the Brits in the Raj, they would serve it up as mutton because they knew that the Brits like their aged lamb. So if you ever go to India, let me tell you, when they're telling you it's mutton, it's goat. And the Brits ate it up. So lamb used to be scarce around Maine too, because Mainers didn't really have a taste for it. But now it's plentiful, thanks in part to the Iraqi immigrants who were used to eating lamb, and now they operate farms. And we also have the Amish doing the same thing. And we have butchers now who can grind that lamb into a perfect Moroccan sausage called the merguez, which you can now buy at farmers markets or a Rosemont market. I can even go into my local IGA here in Bath, yours, and the butcher will be making Spanish chorizo, hot Italian sausage, and Polish kielbasa ready for you to take home. And this reminds me, I'm sure most of you know, that Portland's phenomenal food scene didn't land like a UFO and come out of nowhere. It came from the boom in small farming all over the state. Adventurous farmers working with chefs began planting more than the traditional potatoes, strawberries, and cucumbers. Now you can go right here to your farmer's market down on the water on Saturday or in Brunswick on Tuesday, Friday, and come home with Italian radicchio and Chinese bok choy and Japanese daikon and Incon blue potatoes, just like your green beans and pumpkins. And as I said about merguez, the butchers can now do more than just cut up your chicken for you. And we don't think anything about it. This isn't remarkable, but the world has come close to us, and this has been revolutionary in a sense. We haven't moved and our stomachs are traveling all over the place. So let's look a little bit more how this revolution came to Maine. I think it's fair to say before our time, the first public eating places were put here by the Scots-Irish fishermen, the Brahmin English merchants of Boston imported as their laborers. We know these folks were masters of home brew, and most likely they opened pubs, which is shorthand for public house, which meant a public gathering place, of which there are not many in Northern Europe. You can still see the remains of an original public house right here up in Dresden, along the Kennebec, in the 18th century Pownell Courthouse. Yes, it was a real courthouse for the time, but at the same time, the building also had a pub, which was the meeting place. And that is what a pub represented. The supposed oldest continuous pub in Maine is Portland, Matthews on Free Street, opened in 1872. We know that people like to gather outside their house to exchange ideas and opinions and meet new people. Socializing like this over something to drink and snack goes all the way back in time. People need hydration, and so until very recently on the timeline, water was dangerous to imbibe unless you carefully boiled it. Alternatives then became imperative, and the pub drink has always been something alcoholic. Here in Portland, the favored drink was most likely grog. Grog is rum combined with lemon or honey and other ingredients, but it always starts with rum. And rum is the alcohol that started in New England thanks to our triangle trade. You may remember that from the history books. Ships sailed out of Portland Harbor laden with salt cod, ice, and timber, and headed for the Caribbean to offload. And then they reloaded the holds with sugar cane, which they either sailed back here to be processed into rum or molasses. That's the origin of the J.B. Brown Company. Or they sailed it across the Atlantic to be sold to Europe, where they picked up tea, spices, and slaves to be sailed back here. There were the biggest sugar processing plant here in Portland was at Indian Commercial Street, and it was J.B. Brown. And I bring this up because sugarcane is a syrup, and these plants were huge evaporators and spinners that broke that syrup down into molasses and a fine powder known as white sugar. And then the dregs were fermented into rum. This is why today the best rum comes from the sites of those original sugar plantations, Jamaica, Barbados, and Puerto Rico. Historically, the Asian drink was tea, leaf-flavored boiled water, and thus the Chinese and Japanese had tea houses elaborated by the British into high tea locales. Remember the Ritz in Boston that was still serving high tea into the 1980s? And then there was coffee, which is berry-flavored boiled water, and that comes from the Middle East, where Muslims are forbidden alcoholic beverages. So for the chance to sit and chit-chat, the Arabs are who created coffee houses, which are now Starbucks all over Portland. And as you know, people sit there for hours, either chatting or interacting with their computers. And so everywhere you will find gathering places in the world centered around whatever is the most obtainable drink, where water was never safe. Portland used to have an Asian-style tea house on Exchange Street, and it still has a few distinct tea shops, including a new one for boba tea. And it is full of pubs, often identified as Irish pubs, to identify them. And of course, none of these drinks you get is native to Maine. We don't grow tea or coffee or sugarcane or produce. But now, thanks to adventurous farmers revitalizing fallow potato acreage, they're growing hops, barley, and wheat. And so we now have a massive surge in beer brewing, and you can go to all over the state and sit and enjoy a beer in a brew pub and talk to your friends or work on your computer. And now we have revived cider brewing. This is one of Maine's favorite local drinks, apple cider. We make such a big deal out of it, in autumn you'd think it was Maine's DNA. But apples are not native to Maine or any place on this side of the Atlantic. They come from the steppes of Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, but evidently passersby on the old Silk Road found them likable enough to do a little takeout, and they started planting apple trees in northern lands like England and Germany. Apples need a moderately chilly climate to survive, and they do not grow in warm spots, which is why you don't hear about apples around the Mediterranean. And it doesn't mean that people who live in these hot climates like that don't like to eat apples. I met a man in Bhutan, high in the Himalayas, whose livelihood was growing apples and then driving them down to steamily Bangladesh, where shoppers would pay to eat apples. We know that somebody on one of those ships coming across the Atlantic, bringing indentured English colonists here in the 17th century, must have carried some apples with them and planted the seeds in New England, which, being chilly, was a very receptive environment. Apple trees are still everywhere in Maine, and they are so popular a food that in October you can climb a ladder and pick your own. And remember the legendary Johnny Appleseed moving those trees westward. Why do you think he was doing that? because people wanted applesauce. It wasn't for apple pie, trust me. Even if we say American is apple pie. It was for the cider, which was fermented into hard cider because water was dangerous to drink, but an alcoholic beverage was safe. And even the children in Boston were drinking rum and hard cider. Food shopping for apples and other ingredients of dinner goes way back, and it may surprise you to know that Portland has the oldest continuous farmers market in America. It came to us from the Revolutionary era when our dairy farmers and small vegetable farmers would come on horseback with their wares to the waterfront, mostly to supply the cargo ships, but local housewives would come down too. That market has moved several times since the 18th century, but traces of its early days are still evident if you look at the street names. Milk Street, Market Street, Exchange Street, all close to those ships in the harbor. And we know it's possible that all the Maine potatoes that got put on those ships and sailed down south are what helped the North win the Civil War. Because General Sherman credited the Maine potato for the success of his march on Atlanta, because he was able to feed the troops and keep them strong. So again, why food is really more important than just your dinner. We think of the Maine potato, but actually potatoes were developed by the Incas, who were mostly in Peru. And the tubers came in many colors, but Europeans obsessed with gold and the purity of white just took back the white potato. Meanwhile, the potato made its way north from South America through Central America, where it wasn't easy to grow in the ground, to the north of America, where it thrived in colder climates like Maine. So the potato is and isn't local, even if Mainers bred larger versions of the original and named them Katahdin and Kennebec. Unfortunately, Aroostook farmers did not take good care of their soil, and after a century, the potato crop was stunted, blackened, and not even fit for making fries. And so Oregon took over the potato market, and that's what you find in your supermarket, Ore-Ida potatoes. Still, you can go to the farmer's market and you will find potatoes in many colors, including the original blue or purple, many sizes and shapes, from oval to round to fingerling. They have names like Austrian pink and Russian banana and French fingerling, and that tells us these were bred somewhere far from our Katahdins. But they're grown here in Maine, and we buy them as Maine potatoes. Another food you find all over Maine at our farmers markets is rhubarb. Great spring tonic, very versatile. With no fuss, you freeze it, enjoy it all winter in pies or breakfast oatmeal. Well, as it happens, rhubarb is native to Mongolia. It got here the long way around. And only the stem is edible. The roots and leaves are poisonous and have been used for millennia as emetic medicine. And this may be why the Mongols carried rhubarb on their invasions and spread it in countries with cold climates, like Belarus and the Baltic states. It was for the medicinal value. But it is said that a Mainer found rhubarb over there and brought it back and introduced it to Maine, and it took off here and went across America. After the Civil War, the French Canadians flowed down our great rivers into Maine to work in all the new mills powered by our waterways. And they brought their eating habits with them too, just like everybody else. These included poutine and tortilla. But the Franco-Americans were insular people, and they didn't necessarily open restaurants. They kept their food to themselves and their Catholic church fairs. And you can still, near Christmas, go to Biddeford and the Catholic Church and buy tortillas, which they sell for fundraising. The first foreign food that really muscled its way into our essentially Scotch, Irish, English diet up and down the East Coast and out west was Italian. At the start of the 20th century, Portland had an influx of Southern Italians fleeing dire poverty with its lack of opportunity. And of course, they brought their eating habits with them. And as you may know, the food of the South is quite different in Italy from the food of the North, which is a much wealthier and more geographically diverse place. The food of the South is known as cucina povera, poor people's food. And I haven't had a big cookbook for cucina povera. Its main ingredient is resourcefulness, scrappiness. It's cheap, but it's always tasty. And much of that food was pasta drowning in a tomato sauce, sometimes with scraps of pork, chicken, or fish cooked into that tomato sauce. So when these Southern Italian immigrants got here to Portland and they started cooking to find their own familiar food, they opened restaurants in Portland, and these became what we now call red sauce restaurants, and you know them. Red and white check tablecloths with candles in a Chianti bottle, spaghetti with meatballs on your plate. There were lots of them in Portland, the Village Cafe and Roma, Maria's, Amato's, Bruno's, and DeMillo's. It tells you how large the immigration movement was into this area from southern Italy. The India Street area was Little Italy, all of it before the Franklin Arterial. And a trace of that is still the Italian festival held every summer at St. Peter's Church, right there. And what do? They put out all their food and they revel in it on the street. It's a big deal. The Italians were naturals for the restaurant business because food was a significant part of their culture. And they did not find that heavy, gravy-laden, unspiced English, Irish food appealing. Because all their restaurants had to get supplies somewhere, Italians then opened grocery stores. The last trace we have of what was Little Italy along India Street is Macucci's, which is still 2 blocks from the Italian St. Peter's Church, where the big food festival is. In the decades before the gourmet boom of the 90s, Leo Macucci would take his truck once a week to Boston, to Little Italy in Boston, and stock up on pizza dough, salami, tomato sauce, grated cheese, and pastas. And he would come back to Maine and make the rounds of all the pizzerias and spaghetti restaurants from Augusta to Biddeford. And then as soon as the Cambodians and Thais came escaping the Vietnam War in the 70s, they opened restaurants down on St. John Street. They had grocery stores of their own to supply them. And there was another one off right now. And now we have distinct Somali groceries and Middle Eastern groceries. We even have a Ukrainian Russian grocery deli in Westbrook. Some of you may know it was Germans who settled up the coast of Waldoboro and early in the 20th century began selling the sauerkraut they made from all the cabbage they grew. Before refrigeration, pickling cabbage like this was the only way to preserve it for winter when nothing else grew. Mainers got such a taste for the preserved cabbage that Morse's sauerkraut flourished into a real business. Now it's a huge business that sells pickles and pickled beets and other German specialties. And you could buy it in your local supermarkets, and you could eat it at a German restaurant in Portland, Schulte and Hare, and Richard's restaurant, a German restaurant in Brunswick. None of this is to be confused with Jewish deli that came to Maine with the immigration of Eastern European and Russian Jews living with the Bronx. The creation of the Franklin Arterial in Portland in the early 70s also demolished what was a thriving Jewish neighborhood rife with delis and synagogues. All that remains is the Synagogue Museum on Congress at India. When the Jewish neighborhood in Portland disappeared, miraculously, Mr. Bagel opened and now has myriad competitors. There's even a Ben Rubin's Knishery now in South Portland. And the father of our esteemed former Senator William Cohen was known as the bagel baker of Bangor. But here's the trick. When they started making bagels here for us, they added to the repertoire what somebody used to call the Gentile bagel, which was cinnamon raisin. That is not what was ever in the European bagel, but they noticed, the deli bakers, that the Americans liked to eat coffee cake and other things with cinnamon and raisins. So they added cinnamon and raisins to their bagels. And we've had immigrants from other states in the United States, and of course they bring their distinct food. And that's why we have Texas barbecue at Terlingua and very different barbecue at Wilson County, North Carolina barbecue. And we had here in Bath for a while, Beale Street, Tennessee barbecue. And now you can go to Salvation and get St. Louis ribs barbecue in Portland. So everybody's telling you where they come from. And we can trace the advent of our Japanese restaurants, which started down on the waterfront in 1980s, to the Japanese discovery that we had fresh seafood, a whole lot of it, while their stocks were dwindling. Some of you may remember how they came here in the 70s in August when a lobsterman would stick a harpoon on the bow of their boat and go after the gigantic bluefin tuna migrating from the Mediterranean. These were 800-pound behemoths for which the Japanese, eager for sashimi, paid a pretty price upwards then of $70 a pound. $70 a pound times an 800-pound tuna was a year's earnings of lobstermen. Japanese would stand on the docks waiting for the boats and slam the fish into their vans and begin butchering it on the way to the airport, where flying tiger planes whisked it off to Tokyo's fish market on sale the next morning. But the Japanese got this bright idea that if they hung around here, they could open restaurants to make use of our seafood in their dishes. And now you can get sushi almost everywhere around here, including in the supermarket, wrapped up to go. This is because we humans aren't really fond of boredom. We do like to shake it up a little bit every so often. We do want to eat something different every so often, just as long as we can be sure it's safe. So we go to one of the immigrant restaurants thinking that they are being policed by the state and the city and so forth. And if you go to the public market house on Monument Square, you will have the world on your plate as it's full of immigrant food stalls. For years, Portland had one exotic food market. It was known as the Oriental Market on Congress Street. Note the name, which dates it. It is owned by Koreans, but they have always stocked Indian spices, Japanese rice, and were for many years the catch-all Asian market. Now we have a huge supply of grocery stores that let us take all the ingredients of a foreign meal home. You can go to the Vietnamese grocery store, you can go to the Cambodian grocery store. If you feel like Italian, you can go to Macucci's or Monte's. You want something more exotic, you can go to one of the halal Middle Eastern groceries proliferating around the Portland area due to the post-war arrival of so many Iraqis, Afghans, Syrians, and so forth. You can get all those gorgeous Iraqi flatbreads at Dina's on Forest Ave or Halal Somali Market. And for the highly educated Indian community here, there is Masala Mahal in South Portland, a spice paradise. There is a wide range of Indian restaurants around here, although the great secret is that all of them are operated by Nepalis and Bangladeshis, except for High Bombay in Brunswick, which is operated by Indians. Mexican food became a craze in the 1980s, guacamole, tacos, enchiladas with margaritas, and we got a lot of restaurants dishing that out. But in the last 10 years, as Central American violence went rampant and immigrants were streaming north in droves, the Mexicans got competition from Colombian restaurants serving cornmeal arepas, which you can buy in Brunswick, and Salvadorian restaurants serving pupusas. And now there's a restaurant on Exchange Street, Puerto Rican. And we're going to we gave you a Portland food map list of all of these restaurants. But they are so numerous due to the mass immigration that the Portland food map cannot even keep up, he told me. Our taste for foreign food is not lost on our supermarket. Seeing customers in all the immigrants and our own desire for something a little different, they have set up special aisles where you can push your cart past displays, as you know, of boxed and jarred ingredients and sections that say Chinese, Asian, Indian, Israeli, and so forth. You can actually take home a package of papadums, which are distinct dried lentil crackers from the hot south of India. There's usually a section for what we call Mexican. It is prepackaged salsa and tacos and guacamole. And we can go by long shelves filled with Italian pasta and sauces. And now there's special produce sections not far from the potatoes and strawberries where you can get lemongrass and dragon fruit, taro and quince, a Middle Eastern favorite, and other fruits and roots you never heard of or found here. This is the secret of the Market Basket's popularity, and it's opening tomorrow in Topsom. And you know the Hannafords in Back Bay off Forest Ave is catering to the immigrant community with that huge display of what's exotic right as you get in the front door. Huge aloe vera stalks, passion fruit, ugly fruit, guava, stuff you would never see before. It's right there to bring them in. But no supermarket chain has satisfied our craving for the exotic better than ye olde Trader Joe. In fact, that is the secret and the whole MO of Trader Joe, the mission of the founder. He noticed that more and more young Americans were getting on planes and going to Europe and Asia, getting a taste for different food. And so he envisioned, Joe Colum, a grocery store that would bring it all home for them. Since that time, Trader Joe's employees roam the earth and watch our trends. And now you can go right into Portland and get peri peri sauce, which is from Mozambique, Greek tzatziki, Yemeni zoo, all of it good to go on your dinner table with a shaker of everything but the bagel spice. So that's the secret of Trader Joe. The enormous influx of immigrants, this enormous cornucopia of eating habits has also given rise to a boom in what we call cookbooks. In other words, somebody had to tell you what to do with all this unfamiliar food you're passing by in the supermarket. You could say that the rage started when the late Julia Child went on public television to teach Americans French cooking. Her startling success led New York publishers to hunt for more influencers, we could call her now, like Julia. And so in the late 1960s and 70s, there was a steady stream of cookbooks coming at us from some supposed expert source, Marcella Hazan on the food of Italy, a diplomat's wife, Penelope Casas on the foods of Spain. And there were all countries America were starting to visit as tourists, meaning in these countries, Americans ate the food and they came home and they wanted to eat more of it. And that brought us Paula Wolford with Good Food from Morocco, which was then seriously exotic. But her book sold hundreds of thousands, and that led to the glamorous film star Mallory Joffrey promoting Indian food, and Diana Kennedy, the food of Mexico, and so on. As more and more cookbooks came from more and more exotic places into our kitchen. I have one from Uzbekistan, and one from Georgia, the country, not the state, and one from Palestine, which is the correct way to say Palestine. So the publishers have got in on this desire for us to try immigrant cooking, if you will. And we have scooped these books up and we have read them, and now we have shows on TV to help us. Maybe we didn't rush out to buy all the recommended ingredients, but now we need at the restaurants to go and taste these dishes. And so the red sauce Italian restaurants became overshadowed here by the new green sauce ones, which was a reference to Northern Italy's now famed pesto sauce. And these were expensive white tablecloth Italian restaurants where every dish had to be explained to you on the menu. You remember they used to tell you everything that was in the dish. The Solo Italiano on Commercial Street is a really good example. And now we have Solo Pane, it's bakery right here, but they still often have to tell you what's in it. And even the original basic Italian pizza place has been upscaled and diversified with gourmet riffs at pizzerias like Otto's. And now there's Peng's Pizzeria in Biddeford, which I'm told has a, get this, pistachio and pickled Fresno pepper pizza. Before this boom, there were fantasy restaurants supposedly transporting you to an exotic locale. Trader Vic's to the South Pacific, Benihana with those charcoal burners taking you to Japan, and of course steakhouses reminiscent of London. But now Valet Steakhouse out on Bright Nav is no longer bright, it is long gone, because we have all these other choices of where to eat. Valet's is also gone because we watch cooking shows on TV and we read the glossy photo-filled new cookbooks coming at us, and the idea of authenticity began to creep in. Suddenly Trader Vic's and Benihana were hokey. And when we began to look at the dishes the immigrants were offering, we realized some of them were a little hokey too, even if we still love and order them. That spaghetti with meatballs on the menu of every red sauce Italian restaurant is not a genuine Italian dish. It was the secret start of what we now call fusion, or I call confusion, the blending of disparate eating habits. The Italians who came to this country quickly noticed that Americans like large slabs of meat on their plate beside a starch. That's what you're taught in home ec. No Italian would eat that way, but to accommodate American customers and bring them in, they decided to put eye-catching sized meat right on the plate with that pasta starch. In Italy, a meatball is golf ball size and most often served with drinks or as an appetizer, which is how you get it at Solo Italiano. In the red sauce restaurant, it became tennis ball size and put on top of an enormous plate of tomato-filled spaghetti. Moreover, in Italy, those meatballs were molded from scraps of various meat, mostly veal and pork. But Italians saw Americans' love for steak and made those giant meatballs only from beef, and we are still eating them up. And that is also, I told you, the story of the cinnamon raisin bagel. The same is true of our favorite Indian dish, chicken tikka masala. The genuine Indian dish is chicken tikka, but in the Raj, the Indian cooks quickly understood Brits like their food smothered in gravy. So they put a thick sauce over the chicken to make their bosses happy. And now chicken tikka masala is on the menu of every Indian restaurant in the United States and is becoming the national dish of Great Britain. It's a similar story for crab rangoon that you find on many Thai Vietnamese menus here in Maine. There is no such dish over in Rangoon. What they have here is the original fusion of crab Rangoon. It sounds exotic to you. Rangoon is the old name of the Burmese capital during the Raj. The truth is a little bit banal, however. Known alternately as crab puffs or crab pillows or cheese wontons, crab Rangoon is essentially a fried Chinese wonton that has been stuffed with American cream cheese and imitation crab meat. You get a bunch of them on the plate. They are crunchy and creamy, and they are prepared the same way almost at every restaurant, so you know what you're getting. You can feel safe. Trader Vic's in San Francisco claimed the crab Rangoon they served, which was on their menu in the 50s, came from an old Burmese recipe. But a food historian out there said it was likely invented in the restaurant's kitchen. After all, nobody knows what cream cheese is in Burma. So, in other words, crab Rangoon is just as American as apple pie. And finally, this is the background of that very popular Chinese dish, General Tso's chicken. There's a very funny, charmingly full-length feature film you can find on the internet called The Search for General Tso. And it's very hilarious. It turns out that General Tso's chicken was named for a 19th century Hunan general, but he never ate anything resembling the sticky sweet dish you get here. The dish was invented by Peng Chan-Kui, a chef from Hunan province. A well-known and talented chef, he orchestrated and supervised the great banquets of the Chinese nationalist government from the end of World War II until they were toppled by Mao Zedong in 1949. And he fled the country, finding refuge in Taiwan alongside the nationalist leadership, Chiang Kai-shek. During the 1950s, Taiwan became the haven for classical Chinese cooking, and Peng opened a restaurant in Taipei, the capital. And for years, he served food inspired by traditional Hunan cooking, his grandmother's cooking, including the now famous General Tso's chicken. But it was not sweet, it was not deep fried, and it was not skinned or boned. It is now all these things as an accommodation to American taste, something its creator said was absolutely crazy nonsense. It got that way by a Szechuan chef who opened a very fancy, the first ever white cloth restaurant, Chinese restaurant in Manhattan. You may have eaten there, the Shunli Palace. It was the first effort, this restaurant, to show American Chinese people could do fine dining, just like the French. The New York City chef, Song Ting Wong, brought his recipe for General Tso's chicken to this media darling restaurant. He wanted to popularize the cooking of his homeland, Hunan and Sichuan, which can be afflictively hot. So in the 1970s, as he was preparing to open this now famous restaurant, he went to Taiwan to look for inspiration from Hunan cooks who were over there. And this is where he discovered Peng and the original General Tso's chicken. He then adopted the recipe to what he had learned from living in New York about Americans' taste: sweet, deep fried, and boned. And that's how you get our version of General Tso's chicken. A recent trend in food was regionalism. Just as we now have two types of Italian cooking, we can't just have Chinese food. We have to choose from Chinese Cantonese or Sichuan Chinese, which is hotter, or Shanghai Chinese, which is oilier. Or perhaps most relevant to us Americans is that our cooking has been broken down now by regions. We have California-style restaurants featuring all fresh food, like the original Cafe Always at 4th Street. We have Cajun restaurants serving up Louisiana cooking. We have New York steakhouses. And that's why we've got so many different kinds of barbecue to choose from. You just don't go to barbecue. Do you want Texas? Do you want Carolina? Do you want St. Louis? And of course, Maine lobster, now that Luke has spread in shacks across the country. So you don't have to come to Portland to eat Maine lobster. And now we've come full circle from these worldly adventures to begin to cherish our local food, our local cooking. We are eating bison, a traditional Wabanaki meat, and featuring fiddleheads and thinking up 100 ways to eat wild blueberries so the rest of the world will buy them. And we have our own Joe Robbins, a Penobscot Indian chef who was nominated this year for the James Beard Best Emerging Chef Award because he is only serving up dishes made 100% from ingredients native to Maine. So we have come all the way back home on our voyage. And that's a peek at the vast food network, which is as old as time and as wide as the world. Because everybody has to eat, and we hope it's something delicious. Any questions? Anybody on Zoom have questions? Any questions? Well, thank you. And next week we're going to look at the oldest, biggest world business on recording history, which is the spice trade. And that cinnamon, that little shaker of cinnamon and the little shaker of salt on your table, so innocuous, you could trace most of history all the way back to the need to find those spices. And they're not only flavorful, but many of them are medicinal, and that is part of the secret. So we're going to look at, in our geography of groceries, the ins and outs and machinations and manipulations of the spice trade. And do keep in mind that the Dutch were so excited about the idea of planting nutmeg and sugar in Suriname that they were anxious to get rid of New York and then give it to the Brits for $10. But do keep in mind that the French were so anxious to do the same with Florida that they didn't mind giving Canada to the Brits either. So those little shakers in your kitchen, of course, love the changing the world. These little shakers for sure. We'll look at all that next week. Thank you. Thank you.